There we go. Anyway, thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you. And I do want to recognize right off the start of this presentation that I'm just one of many moving parts that have lended toward the research and studies that we've been completing on lakes and streams in Indiana, and with many funding partners and a lot of dedicated people toward the cause. And I will say that while Joe introduced me as starting a business, I want to make sure you understand that was never part of the plan for us when I retired. And I'll explain to you how that all happened. So what I want to share with you today is our journey in terms of assessing lake water quality and the condition of lakes in northern Indiana. And so what I want to cover here in this particular talk is taking a look at the sort of temporal and spatial referencing of how did we get where we are currently. I want to share some information about the response of lakes to the chronic nutrient and sediment pollution that they're experiencing, and that we're just beginning to, we're seeing the effect of that in many different ways. And then I'll talk specifically about this old way, I call it. It's not anything novel, but bringing an old way to, in terms of a study design, to generate defensible data that helps us describe and understand what's going on in a specific lake that leads to some very important endpoints. And I'm going to use Lake Wawasee in Indiana. Maybe many of you are familiar with that. It's in Kosciuszko County, kind of in north central Indiana. And then I want to share with you some information about something we've just recently started, and that is to take a look at the lake sediment and the legacy phosphorus that's tied up in many of our lakes. And then we'll talk a little bit about why it matters. And there's one thing to collecting data on any sort of natural system, but then you ultimately have to come to why does it really matter? And data leads to solid adaptive management programs. It leads to protection and restoration using data and solid science. And then also social science is an important part, is that interaction between those outside of our specific area of science and being able to relate information to them, because they certainly are part of the decision making that goes forward. And then of course, funding. Funding for lake assessment and lake restoration is woefully inadequate. And I may mention that a couple of times because we've got a big job ahead of us. Well, so let's take a look at a sort of referencing where we've come from. And I use this slide a lot. So if you've happened to be in a presentation where I've talked before, you probably have seen this slide, but I think it's so dramatic. It's from a journal article, Meyer, 1995, where he shows the approximate location of the virgin old-growth forests in the United States. And you can look at this map and go from 1620 to 1850 to 1920, and you could probably put 2023 on there, 2024, this is 2024 on there, and it wouldn't look much different than 1920. And the point of this is that we have made some huge landscape level changes to the ecosystems across the United States. And I'm not saying they're bad, I'm not saying they're good, but one thing we can always count on is that nature will have a response whenever you make these kind of ecological changes. And unfortunately, in the world of limnology or lots of any sort of ecological research, we don't always have we don't have any science really that helps us understand what were these systems like in 1620. And so what is our end goal? What are we trying to do to reach some endpoint in terms of our restoration work? And one of the dramatic changes that have occurred has been in the stream and hydrology world. This illustration comes from Oberholster, from the Land Studies Incorporated, where he shows here a braided stream channel in a valley. And if you'll notice the level of the topsoil and then the base or the cobble and gravel, and then the bedrock, obviously it's an illustration. what's happened as forests have been cleared in land development, especially for agricultural purposes, we've changed the hydrology of these streams and we've combined them. And this is being generous to say that there's two streams like this draining an area. Typically in our part of the world, there might be one, and it's a deeply incised ditch. And then what happens upon that is you see the soil that has been deposited in the lower part of this valley, and it completely changes the hydrology and it changes the morphology of the streams. And it does a really good job and everything else that might be with it. And so really it's all about watershed. This isn't anything new probably to anybody on this webinar, but when you dig a little deeper, this is where the action is. This happens to be a picture of a launder ditch that drains into Lake Wawasee. It has been in continuous seed corn for a very long time. I don't know exactly how many years. And you can see the center pivot irrigation system. And you can see, look at how close the field is to that open ditch. And the ditch banks are almost vertical. They're very unstable. And so this is sort of the ecological deck of cards we've been given to help us understand what's happening in a lake. And again, it could be any lake, but in this case, it'll be Lake Wawasee. And so I say that gravity is alive and well. Water's going to run downhill. It's going to, if you increase the velocity, the volume, and through these channels that are not well built to handle that volume of water. And particularly you see this often with urban streams where you increase the impervious surfaces that changes the whole hydrology of that stream, and you can have huge effects on the stream banks. Now, so this is an agricultural ditch, one of our research streams when I was at Manchester teaching. And while this looks very gruesome, I want to show you, I'm going to divert just a little bit from my presentation to show you that really there was a design here, but just so you can see what we were dealing with. So we were actually doing an experiment to build a natural channel design to correct the huge stream bank erosion that you saw in that previous picture. And so in this case, we built two 12-foot wide benches at about the 2-year flood elevation on both sides of the stream and put a 3-to-1 slope on the sides. And so I'll just kind of run you through a series of pictures here so you can kind of get your head around this. This was a 1,500-foot long restoration project for the stream. We had a lot of water quality data on it, and we also had a lot of biological data as well. And you can see that over time it began to heal. And the white gizmos there on the left is one of our gauge stations where we were collecting water. And here's one of the beautiful things about this design. It can carry a huge amount of water and has a lot of storage capacity. Now, does it reduce nutrient and sediment export? Minimally, because by this time, once sediment and nutrients are in the water, then it's just a function of time until they're going to continue to move downstream until they're deposited at some point. And so this is what it looked like in 2019. And then in 2023, the farmer agreed to putting a 125-foot buffer in warm season grasses on both sides. And this looks very different than the first picture I showed you. It's still a huge source of nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment, but it does create some wildlife habitat and stream bank stability, and among a variety of other things we saw improved there. So what I want to shift to relative to lakes now is water quality and water quantity. They go hand in hand. The biggest threats to a lake is nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And we looked at we did a lot of stream research when I was at Manchester. We saw high levels of nitrogen, high levels of phosphorus, and high levels of sediment. In fact, so much so, I call it a great chronic pollution spill. And while we have to be sensitive in terms of the source of this, what we do know is that the bulk of this material comes from agricultural fields. The stream that I showed you a picture of earlier was 80% cultivated agriculture, and there were over 400,000 hogs in confined animal feed operations in that 15,000 acre watershed. But we had a good relationship with the farmers. The farmers weren't purposefully allowing things to happen where there were any kind of necessarily drastic spills of any kind. They're simply trying to make money in the best way that they could in an agricultural setting. But what happens, no matter what, when sediment and nutrients leave the farm fields, it becomes then a negative externality that is borne by everybody, and including the river, including the lake where it's deposited. And of those three things I mentioned, the sediment is by far and away the largest non-point source pollutant that we have to deal with. And so it's a major issue. It's one that we just have to be able to address. Now, where you see the effect of these things is when you cool up this nutrient and sediment laden water. If you are on this webinar and you deal with water, the hypoxic zone is in the Gulf of Mexico is well studied, a lot of research on that, and we know where it's coming from. The agricultural Midwest and the loss of sediment and nutrients. And when it's ponded up in the Gulf, it results in this huge part of the Gulf where the dissolved oxygen is limited. Another place where we see the effect of this is South Florida. In fact, I was just in a meeting with some folks from the Everglades Foundation, and we were discussing phosphorus pollution, which is what we're dealing with here. And this is a classic case. If you look at the map, you can see Lake Kissimmee and the Kissimmee River, which used to be a 100-mile long meandering river from the Lake Kissimmee to Lake Okeechobee. In the 60s, it was straightened to become a 50-mile straight ditch. And it didn't take long. And I should say agriculture was allowed then to be able to use the adjacent landscape once the ditch drained a lot of the wetlands. And so there was a huge nutrient input. And that didn't take long for Lake Okeechobee to respond. In fact, I call this phosphorus pollution on steroids. And what I learned from our meeting is they now estimate there's 50,000 metric tons of phosphorus in the sediment, just in the sediment of Lake Okeechobee. And of course, and then just recently, I don't know if you followed this, but as water levels rise in Lake Okeechobee, like they did over this past winter, they have to release that water. And it goes down the St. Lucie Canal off to the east, or to the Caloosahatchee River off to the west. And what we do know too, when that phosphorus laden water hits the Gulf or the Atlantic, especially on the Gulf where it comes out right behind Sanibel Island and in Pine Island Sound, it's a prime source for red tides. And so it's a serious problem that's going to take millions and millions of dollars. And you can see here, in fact, this was just in an email to me today from the Everglades Foundation, where the federal appropriations for 2025 is being suggested to be $444 million. Last year, they had $425 million, and the state has appropriated $740 million through 24 and 25. I wish we had just a small part of that for at least, I'll say, Indiana lakes where we are dealing with similar sorts of issues. Lake Erie, another example of what happens when you pond up this sediment and nutrient-laden water. And this becomes a serious issue with harmful algae blooms and too much phosphorus. A little closer to home, in one of our research lakes, is a little lake about 240 acres in size in Fulton County, and I've inserted a map there. You can see the red outline. This is one of the southernmost glacial lakes in Indiana. It's fairly shallow. We have just finished a 2-year study on this lake, and one of our trips to the lake on 13th of January last year, when we visited, there was one of the most severe blue-green algae blooms we've ever seen. In fact, it was so bad, there was a strong wind coming off the lake, and we could not stand there because of our eyes were burning, our noses were being irritated, and it was a major release of toxins from that blue-green algae bloom. And if you look at this picture, you'll see some kids walking along the lake bank, and it turns out that those kids were on that pier, and they were ready to go swimming in this water. And so while we normally wouldn't do it, we went and told them about this and suggested they not, and they didn't. In fact, this thing was so bad, and this is the main inflow into Bruce Lake that drains about 65% of the watershed into the lake. And you can see the roof shingles on top of the house. And the toxins were so bad, aerosols were so bad that the people roofing this house had to get off of the house because they couldn't breathe the air. This should never, ever happen in any inland lake. And what we're doing now is reaping the effect of the chronic nature, and in this case, particularly phosphorus pollution. So, I call these the forgotten dead zones. And so for those of you outside of Indiana, I put a black line that fairly closely represents the Northern Lakes region to the north, and the Tipton Tilt Plain and other physiographic regions to the south, in the south part. And I've highlighted but it's kind of small, but you'll see kind of an orange lake in the kind of the middle top of this map, and that's Lake Wawasee. And so what I want to share with you is what really pulled me out of retirement, which was a meeting with the Wawasee Area Conservancy Foundation. That's what the WACF stands for. And they knew that when I was at Manchester that we had been doing a lot of water quality work on the Eel River and some of the tributaries like the one I showed you. And they asked if I would come down and sit and talk with them. Great group, one of the best lake associations or conservancy districts anyway. And so I put up some questions that one of the first questions they asked me was, what are all of these reports telling us? They probably had a dozen different diagnostic studies done on the lake. So what are they telling us? What is the right project design? What parameters should we be measuring? When and where should we be measuring? And how long? And then what? What do you do? And so it was an interesting conversation, and it led to the beginning of Ecosystems Connections Institute, when my wife and I, Melinda, thought we were just going to go fishing. And so I looked at a lot of these designs, and I pulled out one in particular, a watershed management plan from 2007. The conclusions you see here are a result of 2 water samples over 2 years, a high flow and a low flow. And I just pulled out some of the 2 recommendations that were made. Reduce the nutrient loads by 25% over the next 10 years. Reduce sediment loads by 50% over the next 5 years. Well, how do you do that? What do you compare to even know if you've come close to 25% if you don't know what are the external loads coming in to begin with? So there's just my takeaway from these reports, and every one I've ever looked at, is that there's this huge gap in understanding and knowledge that's based on data that helps us be able to explain what's happening to the lake holistically, and to be able to make a claim like this, to have sort of an ecological line in the sand that allows us to have these target values and know if we're really making a difference. And so a couple other studies, one was done by EPA in 1976, and here they recommend that this is based on 14 water samples, so they were really, this is a pretty robust number of water samples for a study back in the day. And they were recommending that phosphorus should be reduced by 1,025 pounds. The 2007 study was recommending on their 2 samples that there should be a reduction of phosphorus of 135 pounds. Well, so now I'm just kind of jumping ahead a little bit into our study design for Lake Wawasee. It's called the WINS, or the Wawasee Inlets Nutrient Study, which we just finished up our 5th year. And each year we analyzed over 2,700 water samples. We were able to accurately, not based on a model or regional gauge stations, the water budget for the lake, the nutrient and sediment budget for the lake, we were able to come up with accurate load reductions, as well as these defensible benchmarks that now the WACF has, so that for future studies, they have a standard operating procedure to be able to see how well they're doing in terms of their management, adaptive management. So when I was teaching, I used to teach students to always, in a scientific study, you need to know what's wink. What is not known? What do we not know about this particular topic? And then to develop some narrowly defined questions to help us answer what we don't know. So while we know this, here's what we don't know. And so in the case of Wallow Sea, what we didn't know was the water entering and leaving the lake accurately. We had no understanding of the external loadings of the nutrients and sediment, and nor did we have any idea of which tributary. It would only be conjecture if someone suggested that, well, this tributary is worse than the other one. Here's where we should be focused. We did not have that level of understanding. There was a lack of understanding for what we didn't know were the internal loadings of the nutrients. And as I mentioned earlier, we have included this next parameter to look at. We've learned that it is a very significant thing for us to understand. And that is this legacy phosphorus that's tied up in the lake sediment. And I'll share with you more detail about that approach here in a few minutes. And then all of this leads to, well, so if we know all this information, what are the load reductions, especially phosphorus? Phosphorus is really the troublesome molecule, as we know, because once it's there, and it doesn't change in atmospheric forms, and it's very difficult, as we would say. It's just a problematic molecule to deal with in water. And then, of course, there's the social science. And at the lake, great people around Lake Wallow Sea. And as I mentioned, agriculture is a big part of the watershed. It accounts for about 65% of the watershed. And wonderful farmers, great people, but they didn't talk to each other. And so you had the lake community, and then you had the farming community. And one of the first things that I mentioned to the WACF folks when we met is you got to open up a conversation with everybody within the basin who might be contributing the nutrients and the sediment to the lake. And so at that point, once you have the data, then the next phase is you have to leverage that data with specific milestones that will make a difference. There are plenty of reports, and I'm sure you all know this. And as a scientist, it's always fun to learn about all of the workings of a natural system, what makes it tick. But we have to be able to explain it in ways that people understand it, and that they make changes in the way they live their human endeavors. They change in order to reduce the sediment and nutrient pollution that lands in the lake. In fact, I remember one conversation when I was meeting with the WACF folks, and they were talking about wetlands and trapping nutrients. And I said, well, the best nutrient and sediment trap in the entire basin is the lake. And they all kind of raised their eyebrows. But that's typically what it is. And as in the examples that I showed you, it's in the hypoxic zone of the Gulf, or Lake Erie, or Lake Okeechobee. We see it all the time. In various places. So the study design that we used for the Wallow Sea Inlet's nutrient study was a team approach. There's a lot of collaboration here, a lot of discussions with the folks with WACF. And so we looked at each tributary coming in, and you can see the map here where there's 1, 2, 3, 4 primary inflows, and then the outflow at the north end of the lake. And so we identified those sources, and we set up water quality gauge stations. And each one of these gauge stations housed automatic water sampler, a flow meter or a data logger to calculate the volume of water. And there are two things to understand loads that you must have. One is you must know the concentration of the constituent or the parameter, and you have to know the volume of water that measurement was taken. And so we also measured rainfall, and we looked at water temperature, and you can see the example of this gauge station that is there in the right-hand side of this particular picture. Inside that culvert, we use ISCO water samplers. These are commonly used in various places. However, went in our work, this was a rare thing to ever find, at least in a study for an Indiana lake. Virtually every study we ever looked at on an Indiana lake was grab samples. And so, a lot of that's being driven by money, economics, because obviously this is more expensive way to understand what's going on in the lake. Oops, sorry. Inside this, there's 24 bottles, and ISCO samplers can be programmed to put various amounts of water in each bottle. You can tell it to sample every 4 hours, every 6 hours, every 8, whatever time you want. We selected every 4 hours for a 500 milliliter sample to be taken at each of our gauge stations. And then stream discharge was recorded on a data logger inside the white box that you see here. And now we have a sort of a different data logger that we use that actually has a telephone modem on it, and all of this data is transmitted back to our lab where it's stored, and everything's run with a solar panel. So the study design included, and here are the initial places where we set these. At the top is Turkey Creek outflow, or the outflow of the lake. Martin Creek in the bottom kind of right, and then Papakichi inflow was a grab sample site as a tiny trib that drained Lake Papakichi. And then Turkey Creek inflow, which Turkey Creek is the largest of the watersheds, Upper Dillon or Greater Dillon Creek and Upper Dillon Creek. And so after a year or two of this, well, let me back up a minute. Each one of those sites were sampled April through June, collected 6 samples daily. Those samples had to be picked up every day, April through June. Weekly grab samples in those outside of April and June. And then monthly lake samples and lake profiles were taken at the green dot out in the deepest part of the lake. Stream discharge was measured continuously during the entire study. And so what this led to was, wow, so now we can see where the sediment and nutrients are coming from. So, and it's just like any other study, and it was really a lot of fun watching the folks on the ecology committee with WACF. Once they started seeing the data generated, they go, wow. So we want to know, where is it coming from? For example, Turkey Creek, if we look at Turkey Creek inflow. And I will mention that there are a chain of shallow lakes in Turkey Creek inflow, and it's about an 80-acre wetland, Turkey Creek wetland, down toward the lake. And so, but they were curious about where's all the nutrients and sediment coming from entering Turkey Creek inflow. So we ended up putting a gauge station at Galloway Ditch and Piper Ditch to try to refine the source, the upland source of what we were seeing at our gauge at the bottom into the basin. Same way with Warner Ditch. Warner Ditch was that picture of the continuous corn, or the seed corn field that I showed you earlier, and Upper Dillon Creek. And so you can see we started shifting our gauge stations around just a little bit to kind of get a little different perspective of where the nutrients and sediment were coming from, all the while using that information to think about what needs to be done to mitigate the effect of all of them. So from January to December, each year, 2019 through 2023, we analyzed 2,745 water samples each year. That's over 18,000, almost 19,000 individual tests that we ran in our lab. We use a SEAL analytic auto analyzer to do the chemistry, and we gravimetrically and looked at the sediment as milligrams per liter, but also optically looking at NTUs as well. We looked at total phosphorus, soluble reactive phosphorus. We looked at 3 species of nitrogen, and started trying to piece together what was really going on. So this is the outflow of Dillon Creek. And this was after about a 3-inch rain over 24 hours. And you can see the mud plume that has come out into the lake. And so this actually is a place where we have an automatic sampler or gauge station. And so we captured, just to illustrate the importance of using samplers, these are the samples over 2 days that captured that plume. And so it's clear, I mean, it's easy to see as you go from the left bottle, these are bid every 4 hours apart. So this 2 days, you can see exactly when that sediment hit the gauge station. And you can see as it kind of diminishes until you get to the far right bottle where the water's clear again. And you can understand clearly too, what happens if you take a grab sample anywhere across that spectrum, what you might miss or what you might overestimate. So what we did here was we put a star and a blue circle on the stars on a clear bottle, the circle on a turbid bottle, and let's take a look here. So the clear bottle, the suspended sediment, TSS, total suspended solids, on the clear bottle was 2 milligrams per liter. And if you take the flow that was measured at that time, it would equal 8 pounds in 24 hours. Now let's just go back. So the circle then, the turbid bottle, the suspended sediment, and this happened within 4 hours, 232 milligrams per liter, or again, if you take that same flow measurement, 18,777 pounds in 24 hours. A remarkable increase. And if we look at phosphorus, the clear bottle was 0.24 milligrams per liter, still high for what we want to see as our target value of 0.03. But look, and at 6.7 pounds in 24 hours at that flow rate. But look what happens in that turbid bottle. The total phosphorus goes to 0.72 milligrams per liter and 142 pounds in 24 hours. 1 pound of soluble reactive phosphorus can grow up to 500 pounds of algae. It literally takes a tiny amount of phosphorus that's bioavailable to cause severe ecological response in a lake. And this is part of the chronic issue that we're dealing with, is the consistent year after year after year of these materials moving into the lake. So this is a graph that was prepared by Beth Morris, who's the chair of the ecology committee, and I modified it slightly, but just to give you some idea of the value of this data. So this is 2019 through 2022, and this represents the percent of phosphorus or nitrogen in sediment, depending on the color of the bar. The blue is phosphorus, the yellow is sediment in pounds per year. Total nitrogen pounds per year is red, and total the flow there is in the green. And it's not hard to see that Turkey Creek inflow as a percent is a major source of the phosphorus. It's a major source of the nitrogen and a major source of the sediment. And so this allows now to have data to begin to look at, so what's going on in Turkey Creek inflow that we can do to help mitigate and reduce those amounts coming in. Greater Dillon Creek is also a big contributor. I would say combined, Turkey Creek and Greater Dillon Creek contributes nearly 80% of the nutrient and sediment load that enters into Lake Wawasee. So the other thing that we wanted to look at then, as we know the external loads, we know we have data in terms of the internal loading. We were able to calculate load reductions based on Vollenweider, and adding those external loads are critically important for us to be able to do the calculations necessary to make sure we get it right. But we were also, at least just recently, we've become very interested in this legacy phosphorus that may be tied up in the sediment. And so the dots that you see here represent the location of where we took sediment samples from in Lake Wawasee. And we also wanted to take a look at Turkey Creek wetland. One thing we learned is, and we've seen this consistently in various places, even though you have a wetland does not mean that you've mitigated any export of phosphorus. In fact, we have seen this in a number of places where wetlands actually have a higher export of phosphorus than other non-wetland sites. And in this case, you can see that the wetland doesn't really have laminar flow. It has a stream that's going through it that's coming from lakes upstream and also from upland sites that are above it. And so we were curious, just because of the high phosphorus levels we saw at our gauge station, and you'll see the arrow indicating the point already included in the lake sediment sampling site is near where our gauge station is. And so we took a look at the phosphorus levels. And while I can't share the data with you because it's proprietary to WACF, I can tell you that this wetland is literally an ocean of phosphorus that has accumulated over decades of the phosphorus coming in from the upland sites, moving through the 10 lakes or these shallow lakes that I mentioned that are upstream of it. And this has been a great trap. Now, I'm not minimizing the importance of wetlands other than their ability to sequester phosphorus necessarily. They're good at reducing nitrogen through denitrification, certainly great for wildlife and vegetation. And they have many other and hydrologic considerations that help mitigate those large spates where you have heavy rains. There's a lot of benefits to wetlands, but you must not think that just because you have a wetland that you are sequestering phosphorus and keeping it out of the lake. So, oh yeah, this is one of our hard workers. I call this the Turkey Creek Wetland Wet Fanny Award. The fellows that went out to collect these samples, this wasn't the worst condition, but it was a very hazardous job to go out and get those sediment samples. So what I'm going to share with you is some data from a surrogate lake, and this is Bruce Lake that I showed you the blue-green algae from, just to show you the fractionation from these analyses that we've been using for the sediment samples. And if you look at the lake map, you can see the sites. I think 2 is not on here, but we had 10 sample sites in Bruce Lake. And you'll notice that we've actually targeted the deeper parts of the lake, and we targeted where the inflows enter into the lake. So where you see Baker Ditch Inlet, that is a place where we had a gauge. If you go up to site number 1, that's the Overmeyer Ditch, where I took a picture and showed you a picture of the blue-green algae bloom earlier. And that is the drains the largest part of the watershed. And then we can look at just briefly these different areas, this fractionation of the phosphorus into these different forms. But the takeaway message here is we can see now, in this case, Baker Ditch Inlet has some of the highest levels of bioavailable phosphorus of anywhere in the lake. We can see, if you look at site 8 and site 2, I'm going to paraphrase this because there's too much going on in these graphs to really kind of walk you through. But we know that the deeper parts of the lake, that's where you find the accumulation of phosphorus. And the reason that's important is that if you engage in sequestering phosphorus in a lake, which is possible, this allows you to be very targeted in where you would go after to try to sequester that extra phosphorus that's already in the lake. And at the same time, initiate these adaptive management plans to stop the source, basically. So here are the questions we were able to answer through our studies with Lake Wallacea. We were able to describe the hydrology of the lake, looking at hydraulic residency time and flushing rate with real data. We were able to calculate external loads by tributary. We were able to identify these external loads and where should we target mitigation, conservation practices. What farmers should we sort of begin to try to work with and reach out to? And so it's targeted mitigation. That is the long game, and it's a very slow process. But having data, I can tell you from experience, you go to speak to somebody, a farmer or a property owner of any kind, and if you could approach them in a way that says, look, here, we want to share with you this data that we have, the conversation will go much better than just pointing fingers and saying, oh, you did something really bad to the lake. We were also able to get good data on internal loadings. We were able to calculate accurately the trophic state of the lake. I'm leaving out a lot of details here. We were able to identify the very specific sites where this legacy sediment phosphorus is located, should we decide to go and sequester that phosphorus. And we were able to get the load reductions that were necessary. And I can tell you that the load reductions, the real load reductions, are very different than the two that you saw, one from EPA and one from that 2007 study. They were not even close to being the same. So why does all this matter? By the way, this is Martin Creek. This is the smallest subwatershed you're seeing here in this picture, that big sediment plume. It's only about 700 acres in size. And so you can see that the timing of a rain event, the amount of rain, the intensity, there are lots of variables that go in. You have to plan for the worst case scenario. This is just an awful picture to see. And you know that if you see sediment, you know you have lots of phosphorus coming in with it. But here's why all of this data matters. I know, and we know, that assessing the lake at this level, it's clearly costs more money. But what you get is data that is defensible, and it illustrates the degree to which the lake is, and I'm going to say, in trouble. And I can tell you, after working on several lakes in northern Indiana, the lakes are in serious trouble relative to phosphorus and nitrogen and sediment entering into the lake. It provides the data for developing this adaptive management plan to help stop the source or to target phosphorus sequestration. It's fundamental to building what I call a cultural bridge from the lake community to all of the human endeavors across the basin. It helps provide that starting point for the conversation. It leads to the economic value of the properties around the lake. We haven't seen, well, I'm not an economist, but boy, Bruce Lake is in trouble. I mean, imagine what that might be doing to the property values where you have these consistent and harmful algae blooms like that. And I do want to mention one other thing about Lake Wawasee here, because we took the data from this wind study and we leveraged that data to help the lake basin become a national water quality initiative through the Natural Resources Conservation Service program. This is the first lake basin in Indiana to receive that designation. And it brought with it $1.2 million of cost share money to the farmers in the basin of the lake. It opened the conversation with the farmers. So they've had farmer breakfasts that have been well attended. They have a boat that tours the lake called the Lily Pad. We've had 2 events for the farmers. So getting the farmers on the lake to let them see it and share with them the data. We've had on-farm meetings. So people from the WACF have gotten to go onto farms and to see how farmers work and how their management practices. So at least what it's done, it's helped, again, open that conversation between them so that they get to know each other. And usually good things happen when you get to know somebody. And let me just make a pitch here for regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture, and you may want to look this up if you haven't and you're not familiar with it. In my opinion, this is the secret sauce to helping correct the loss of nutrients and sediment from agriculture. And so I'm going to just give you an example. If a farmer can increase the organic matter of the soil by 1%, that organic matter has water holding capacity of about 27,000 gallons of water. When you start doing the math on that across a landscape, it is a huge amount of water that can be stored in the soil rather than to allow it to run off. I wish I had more time to talk to you about regenerative agriculture, and I hope you begin to do some research on this. because it is the future. I truly believe it is the future of agriculture. I believe, and not my lifetime, but I truly believe there will be a day when we do not see brown cultivated fields in the fall time or in the winter time across the Midwest, and they will always have some kind of a growing crop. And it will have a huge landscape level change in terms of what we wrestle with in terms of trying to slow down this eutrophication process that we see in our glacial lakes. So, I would say facts are, this is from John Adams. He says, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the tenets of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Data and evidence, defensible evidence, is what's missing in action. It's applying good science to help us get the data necessary to advance our cause, to protect in some cases. I'm sure whoever's out there, you may work in areas where there are lakes, and we do. There's places we need to be protecting the lake. And then there are some lakes like poor little Bruce Lake that it needs full restoration. And finally, I was thinking about this project, this talk, and I heard the song, and you probably, I bet when you read this, you'll probably start singing the tune, "The Big Yellow Taxi." And and I'm not going to try to sing it because you would all probably leave, but you can read it. And I truly believe there's some relevancy to this, that we may not appreciate what we have in front of us. And I would say a generational legacy opportunity to change the trajectory of what we're seeing happening to our beautiful glacial lakes as we watch them die, many of them dying right before us. We don't want to be the generation that allows that to slip away without advancing the cause and bringing the appropriate amount of money that it really will take to make our lakes safe, so that no lake, no people living around the lake should ever experience a harmful algae bloom like I illustrated to you earlier. So I want to thank you for inviting me to come and to speak to you. It's just been an interesting experience to be able to do research on lakes across the northern part of the state. And I wish you all well. And if there's questions, Joe, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Well, thank you, Jerry. I'm fired up over here. You've got me excited and ready. I'm a Joni Mitchell fan, among other things, so I appreciate the reference at the end there.
You were singing it, weren't you?
I was.
Yeah.
They also don't want to listen to me sing.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
All right, so we've got just a few minutes for questions, about 8 minutes for questions. We do have some questions coming in. If folks have questions, feel free to hover down to the bottom of your screen to that Q&A button and submit your questions. I'll moderate them, and we're gonna go lightning round style with Jerry here while we've got him, and we'll ask some questions. So, let's see. So the first one is a sort of a long one, but I think it's a good one. So I'm a citizen of an inland lake in eastern Michigan, Oakland County. So this is a highly developed county in Oakland, in Michigan. The lake is primarily used for recreation, but could become a conservation model owing to the wealth of the citizens on the lake. Are there plug-and-play monitoring programs that measure the items you listed in your questions we were able to answer slide, such as the internal and external loading and trophic states? And which of these are low-hanging fruit that should be pursued first? So if I'm on this highly developed lake, what should I be monitoring and what should I start with?
Well, I'm all for, with all respect, whoever's out there engaged in citizenry science, I'm all in on citizenry science at some level, especially on the educational level. But at this level of assessment, I think that it would be helpful to have a professional limnologist to help guide that process. You can spend a lot of money and collect data that will be meaningless. And so are there plug and play? I think, are there sensors that can do some of this work? Yes. Their technology is there to set up what would be called smart gauges or sensors that can measure some of this. Now, it doesn't get to total phosphorus. That's the one that's kind of missing. I think there might be one sensor that does that. These are very expensive instruments. And I'll tell you, I'm old school. I like a bottle of water and I like to get it in the lab. But the technology has changed a lot. So there are some sensors, and we do use those, especially on our lake profiles. We use sondes, but that really increases the cost of the project a lot. But certainly you want to take a look at the inflows, what tributaries are coming in. So to get that external load, you want to do a really robust sampling of those because they can change. You saw in those bottles how quickly that water quality can change in just a few hours, depending upon the size of the watershed. And then, of course, you have to understand what's leaving the lake. You have to understand what's in the lake. And these are all it's like a big jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to mathematically put together. And I have left out a lot of the calculations that go on behind the scenes, but there are a lot of mathematical calculations to get to the end game. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right. At the very end, you mentioned the NWQI designation. Can you talk about the process for getting that NWQI designation, who you had to talk with on the front end, what you had to go through to get that?
Yeah.
If somebody's thinking about pursuing that themselves in their area, and then also what does that mean in terms of, allowing you to access funding? How does that bring those funds to your lake?
So the NWQ program, National Water Quality Initiative, is a program that's administered through your local Natural Resources Conservation Service office in partnership with the SWCD. It's under the Department of Agriculture. And so the first thing that we had to do what was called a readiness grant, where we had to do a mini basin-wide assessment. So, I mean, it was easy, it was long and kind of involved, but we were able to use the data that we collected from the study to say, well, based on this research, we know that we need to reduce the export this many pounds from this subwatershed and this many pounds. We need to here's our target value for the lake. Here's where the opportunities are in terms of the subwatershed and the number of agricultural acres that would be eligible for taking cost share dollars from the program and then using it on the farm. So I wouldn't say it's complicated. I'll call it convoluted. It's a convoluted process, but the NRCS, or the Natural Resources Conservation Service district conservationists, will help guide you through that process. So in our case, we had a two-step process. We had the readiness grant at the front end, which drove the request for the dollars, which is driven by the available acreage of farmland that would be eligible to spend it. And so that's how we got to $1.2 million. And I should say that's over 4 years. But I also want to say that while we appreciate the NWQI dollars because it really shows an outward expression of the lake folks wanting to actively be engaged and say, look, we're really doing something here with this data and communicating with the farmers. You want to aim higher than that with conservation practices, and that's where I think regenerative agriculture, and I could spend another old time, Joe, talking about regenerative agriculture. That's where I think the bar should be in terms of managing agricultural land.
Thanks, Jerry. All right, I think we have time for one more question. This person was impressed by the presentation and said, it's a really good pitch to get people to buy into the methods you laid out. And we need to push EPA to begin funding Section 314 grants again. So that's one pitch for a mechanism for funding these studies. Do you have ideas or recommendations on how folks who are watching this presentation and thinking, gosh, I'd like to do this on, a lake in my area, how can folks pull together funding or identify funding sources for these sorts of studies?
So we help as much as we can on, we work with a lake association or conservancy district. Some conservancy districts can increase revenue through clean water fund. I would suggest to anyone out there that's involved with a lake that you should start a clean water fund. And you know, we've gone to lakes where they say, well, we collect a $25 annual fee for belonging to the association. That's not good enough anymore. Unless, you know, if you're really serious about taking corrective action. I call it conservation sticker shock, where, you know, we just have not quite yet realized the investment that we need to make. And where that money comes from, I'm not real sure. But to do it right, we need to invest in our lakes at some level, whether it's the federal government, whether state government, or the partnership like you operate. You should be flushed with money, Joe. You should be handing out hundreds of thousands of dollars to help correctly. I know that goes above your pay grade. You don't have any choice about it, but it just illustrates the lack of funding that's there to really do things right. And so, but we do work with associations to help them find resources, grants. There are some out there. In Indiana, we rely heavily on the Lake and River Enhancement Program here in Indiana, and they've been very good about funding, beginning to look more closely at this approach that we've been taking.
Thanks, Jerry. That's a lot of really good ideas, and I agree with you. We'd love to be providing more funding through the MGLP, and I agree that conservation in general funding for watershed improvements and for lakes is struggling. So it's tough.
I do want to tell you this, if I have time, Joe, tell this real quick story. I've never been involved in politics in my life, zero. But through one of our lake studies at Sylvan Lake, I met a state legislator, and he lives on the lake. And Sylvan Lake is a hyper-eutrophic lake. And he said, what do we need to do to get this fixed? I said, well, one of the things we need is we need more funding for layer projects. He took that. Again, I was able to help feed him information, but he was so passionate about this. He took that to the state legislature. He got a bill through, increased funding for layer by $1.2 million.
Wow.
So, and he has his eyes on even more. So he sees that. And you know, we spent, in fact, yeah, well, I won't tell the next story, but I have lots of stories about that sort of thing. But anyway, I wouldn't hesitate to contact your state legislator, especially if they live on a lake.
I was just gonna say, I do know that the good thing about the Upper Midwest in general is that, you know, a lot of us are lake people, and often you have those influential folks that live on lakes that are thinking about lake issues. So
and here's the bottom line to everybody out there: the lake will tell us when we get it right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to end it. So, Jerry, I want to just say thank you from the MGLP for giving a webinar.
Thanks.
Really, this is incredibly informative, and I think there was a lot of engagement from the folks in the participation. We had a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to today. For folks that are still on, we will be sending out a video recording of this webinar, and I'll be CCing Jerry on that email that I send out. So if you have follow-up questions we weren't able to get to here that are burning questions for Jerry, you can follow up with him via that email. And I'd encourage you all to tune in next week. So next week we've got Caitlin King is going to be giving a presentation. That's March 19th, casting a wide net using historical data to build understanding of changes in fish species over time. So looking forward to that talk as well. Encourage everybody to go check that talk out. And with that, I'll just say thank you to everyone on the call for the work you do for our lakes, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.